doing session number 6 in our series of AEA webinars. Chris, welcome, and over to you.
TOGAF. And actually, it turns out that this may turn into a multi-parter, if that's okay, just because there's a lot of content to cover, along with hopefully some practical demonstration. So we're going to start off with part 1 today being about modeling and analysis. So just a little bit about APG. You know, we're basically here to help advance the practice of information and technology and systems engineering capabilities to support business outcomes. And we're participants in many standards organizations, including the Open Group, where we participate in TOGAF, IT for IT, and Archimate, amongst other initiatives, as well as modeling specifications at the OMG and the Eclipse framework. And we're also business partners with Sparks, with their Enterprise Architect tool, HP, and Enterprise Maps, and IBM Rational tools. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to review, kind of what TOGAF has to say about capabilities and the context they have in 2 different parts of the standard, namely the architecture development method and the architecture content meta model. We'll talk a little bit about, hopefully don't want to dwell on it too much, about just what exactly is this thing called a capability. It's certainly been something that's been debated a lot within the Architecture Forum and other organizations, and certainly may be something that people on the call may have some interest in. But, really we want to, not dwell on that too much and really get to what's the whole point of creating a capability model. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the typical use cases on why you would build a capability model and what you might use it for. We'll talk about some of the metrics that you might want to think about collecting as it relates to using a capability model. We'll talk about some very simple best practices for building a capability model, talk about how we can map enterprise content to that model for the purposes of what we're going to focus on today is doing some analysis of the enterprise through a lens of a capability model, and then we'll take a look at an example of actually doing this in the real world in Sparks Enterprise Architect. So I presume most people on the phone are familiar with the architecture development method, the ADM, and it certainly has places throughout the life cycle that either directly call out things around capability model, or there's some inferences. So we'll kind of start off a little bit talking about where do capability models show up in the ADM, and some techniques or advice on how you might want to approach creating a capability modeling and using it based on the ADM. So let's start off first by taking a look at the framework and principles phase, the preliminary phase. And so what you're seeing here in the next couple of slides are excerpts from the APG TOGAF process library, ATPL. This is an Eclipse-based tool that we've created for actually tailoring TOGAF and the ADM for end users. And one of the things that we can generate out of that solution are activity diagrams that show the steps of each of the phases. So, one of the things where capability models are going to come into place is going to be in step 5 in tailoring TOGAF or whatever other framework or reference models and meta models you're using. And ultimately, this is where you're going to want to refine your meta model based on capability-based planning. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what TOGAF has to offer out of the box for that. And then once you, tailor your meta model to support whatever kind of capability modeling you want to do, then you need to implement that in your architecture tool set. So that would be likely making some tweaks to the actual meta model in the tool, loading it up with the right kind of data, defining new types of diagrams, traceability matrices, reports. So as many of you know, the activities that are listed within the ADM are non-trivial, and of course, implementing this in an architecture tool may be a project in its own right. When we get into phase A, architecture vision, and again, we can see the way that, from an APG perspective, we've laid out the activities that are in phase A as really a four-way collaboration between different communities of practice within the enterprise. So we've got some activities where requirements management or business analysis could help out. Of course, enterprise architecture is a big part of this. But we really think of organizational development or organizational learning playing a key role in enterprise architecture. In particular, it's called out right away in the evaluate business capability step. So this kind of implies that, well, if we're going to evaluate business capabilities in phase A, that suggests we already have a capability model and that has some metrics or indicators that we can use to do that evaluation. So again, it obviously would make a lot of sense for the enterprise architects to lead and provide guidance and facilitation on creating a capability model, but when it comes to actually operationalizing it and keeping it current and up to date, that's something we want to look to organizational development helping it, at least certainly on the business side. And then when we're actually developing the architecture vision, one of the last steps in phase A, this is where we want to really describe, what the expected usage of a capability model is. I mean, are we going to use it perhaps to drive simplification opportunities within our IT application and service portfolio? Are we going to try to optimize the performance of the business or set it up for innovation? And these are just, again, some of the very typical ways that people want to look at a capability model as it relates to driving architecture-based transformation. And then when we get into phases B, C, and D, this is, the description of the common set of activities in those phases. Starting off right away where we're trying to select reference models, viewpoints, and tools, one of the reference models that we might choose as a basis for some of our modeling is a capability model, which we really think is ultimately a special type of reference model. So the capability model needs to exist before we've hit this activity in phase B, for example. And then if we're, describing the baseline and the target architecture, one of the activities that we might do is map elements that are in the enterprise architecture, business, data, application, and technology to that reference model. And then it's very typical in a capability-based planning approach to use the capability model as a way to create snapshots that describe, well, here's kind of the way things look right now from a capability lens perspective, and here's how things could look in the future. So we need a capability model there to do that gap analysis. And then when we move on to resolving the impacts across the architecture landscape, one of the best ways to do that from a portfolio perspective is to have the ability to look at, all bodies of work that are currently underway or are planned or almost finished through, again, a capability model. So, if you're, messing with 2 or 3 capabilities that are described, you have some line of sight across the enterprise to know if you're doing things that are in, collision or opposition to other development efforts or perhaps opportunities for synergy. Of course, it would be great to know this earlier back in phase A as well. And then when we get to one of the last steps in the architecture descriptions phase is finalizing the architecture, we need a capability model to create detailed capability specifications, which I'll talk about shortly. So there's basically, 2 fundamental ways you can look at configuring the execution of the ADM as it relates to building the capability model, which is the first step. One way to do it is to basically, start up an architecture endeavor, doing that really in phase A, and then determining that you need a capability model in order to, drive the project and help the stakeholders, get their arms around the outcomes. So then that may cause you to, actually go into then phase B and actually start building the capability model. But then when you're building the capability model, you may discover that your metamodel is insufficient to support the way that you want to build that capability model and ultimately how you want to map things to it. So that may cause you to then go back into the preliminary phase and update the meta model and associated tooling. So that's really, the way to do it if you really hadn't had the opportunity to do a more formal execution, where actually an entire cycle of the ADM from the preliminary phase, phase A, all the way into phase E, F, and G, and H, is where we are not just building the capability model, but also putting things into place organizationally to operationalize and that capability model so that it's actually maintained. So that kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where, we want other players within the enterprise, organizational development, business transformation, innovation management, so on and so forth, strategic planning, to be all on board with the capability model, and that, it's just not an enterprise architecture thing, it's really a thing for the enterprise. So it really depends on, again, your level of maturity with enterprise architecture, the kind of time you're going to be given to do this kind of stuff. So, if you're looking for more of the lightweight approach, that's probably number one. But if you do that, you will have to be thoughtful about some of the things that are talked about in number two, namely, if we build the capability model during our body of enterprise architecture work, we're going to have to make sure that we put things in place in phases E and F to actually operate and govern that past that point. So if we take a quick look at, the current TOGAF 9.1 architecture content meta model, hopefully a picture that is familiar to people on the call, you'll notice that capability is up here in the upper right-hand corner with these common elements connected to a work package. And so, if you were to look just solely at the content meta model, it wouldn't necessarily leap out at you really the central way that capabilities can, again, provide a simplified lens for really understanding the complexity of the enterprise landscape. So it's really positioned in the meta model, which again is a starting point, not to be taken literally necessarily, as really being something more associated with phases E and F, when we're doing capability, actually putting together the plans based on capabilities, identifying capability increments, and starting to put together roadmaps and migration plans. But if we take a look at another, standard architecture framework, namely DODAF, this is the Department of Defense Architecture Framework for the U.S. government, you'll notice that capability is really a prominent first-class element within the conceptual meta model, and that it's, traced to other things, but very separate from activities, the things that that we have in place to actually perform capabilities, the resources and tools that are needed, which might include, material and data, as well as the roles and organizations that perform those capabilities. And, of course, we always want to have some traceability from capabilities to our strategic plans as well as it relates to strategies, tactics, goals, and objectives. So if we take a look at, what's the definition of a capability, TOGAF talks about a capability being a business-focused outcome that's delivered by the completion of one or more work packages, and that's pretty, fits pretty well with the way that it's positioned within the current content meta model. But I think it's particularly, it really more gets to how are capabilities possibly used as opposed to what are capabilities themselves, really more focusing on the delivery side. DODAF has a pretty good definition, however, it is a little esoteric. The ability to achieve a desired effect under specified standards and conditions through the combinations of ways and means to perform a set of activities. So it's kind of a little mouthful, and from a semantics perspective is very concise, but we tend to prefer the definition of a capability that's described in the BizBoc from the Business Architecture Guild, namely a particular ability or capacity that a business may possess to achieve a specific purpose or outcome. And the key thing there is may possess. So, capability models are basically, one of their fundamental usages is to describe these are the kinds of things a business needs to do in order to support its business. However, given the maturity of a particular organization, it may not have things in place to actually perform all those capabilities, or if it's a organization that's been around, it's probably got, a lot of things in place performing various capabilities, but there's a lack of concurrence about what parts of the organization are supporting which capabilities and what those are, their consistent set of outcomes and metrics and processes to support that. So that, that calls out, specifically one of the dangers of a capability model is assuming that you must use one just because they sound like really cool things. So for example, smaller startup organizations may not find as much use from a capability model, because one of the things that it really can help an organization is understand the diversity of an organization that's perhaps grown by mergers and acquisitions is one of the most common situations where a capability model is almost always needed, because we're really trying to provide a consistent way of looking at the enterprise, irrespective of what different parts of the business do and what they call their different functions and processes and services and all that sort of thing. So again, be careful about presuming that you should use a capability model just because they exist. So what are some of the the standard use cases for a capability model? One of them is to create a service portfolio, as this relates to a set of business services. So it allows us to, really provide a navigable, easily manageable, hopefully self-service catalog of services that we offer to our customers. And those are typically connected to the lowest level capabilities in a capability model. We often want to use a capability model for analyzing performance of the enterprise through a capability-based lens. And that gives us perhaps the opportunity to get some insight into, which capabilities really should we be making investments in as it relates to new strategic initiatives and, improving our performance. And then ultimately, once we've got a view of the enterprise through that capability-based analysis model, we can then use the capability model to actually put together roadmaps that describe how we're going to evolve the organization over time. And a technique that's certainly familiar to many of us in the IT space is to associate a set of maturity or conformance requirements with each capability as it relates to multiple levels of maturity, very similar to the notion of CMMI, the Capability Maturity Model Integration from the Software Engineering Institute for improving IT processes. And that brings back, again, the idea that if you're going to be using a capability model really for benchmarking, which is kind of what CMMI is ultimately about, even if you're a startup and you don't have a lot of internal diversity, that may be, again, a very effective use of a capability model to, again, compare what you do to an industry standard for how to do things. And so it turns out that, we'll actually take a look at some examples of this in the context of an industry standard reference model. And ultimately, the capability model is going to be used to allow us to map things from other enterprise content. But that's the thing that we really need to understand. What other enterprise content exists? How is that going to be related to a capability? And how might that information possibly be rolled up into the capability model in a way that really helps particularly executive stakeholders not have to get exposed to the gory implementation details of all the complexity across the enterprise. So really providing, again, that simplified lens for understanding the complexity of the enterprise. And really, trying to, bring enterprise architecture to the table as a foundation for making informed decisions. So, an example that we'll take a look at is, one of the ways that people often use a capability model is to provide a simplified yet very informative view of the state of the IT application and service portfolio as it relates to which applications are related to and supporting different capabilities. So slide 13 here is describing a a tailored capability-based planning meta model that's been designed for a specific purpose, particularly looking at doing some assessment of the performance of the organization as it relates to the current level of maturity of each individual capability, the level of performance now and the future, but also the idea that we want to be able to specify some indication of the investment disposition as it relates to each of the capabilities, and that's described by the enumerated value on the right, the whole idea that, you know, a capability is strategic, we're going to maintain it or possibly retire it. But we also have some attributes in the capability that are related to the average health and risk score of the underlying applications and the total annual cost. So maybe, you know, starting back here at the top again, you know, one of the real traditional notions of a capability model is that it's often contextualized by a value chain, which may be expressed as a collection of value streams. And also capabilities, it's very typical for a capability model to be hierarchical. Namely, there's, you know, a small set of top-level capabilities, maybe 4, 5, or 6, and each one of those is decomposed into more finer-grained sub-capabilities, so that would be a 2-level hierarchy. And then sometimes we actually go to possibly a 3rd level. Again, best practice is to, you know, make sure that you don't get too detailed, but, you know, detailed as you need to be. But, you know, as we'll see in a little bit in the example that I'll share with you guys, I'm going to take a very simple approach where there's basically just a set of capabilities directly under the value streams themselves. But there's, of course, other some indicators about capabilities that can be informative. One is the category of capability. Is this a core, supporting, or enabling capability? Again, this may be useful, not always perhaps required, but the idea that there are certain capabilities that really represent what we do as a business and why we're here. Then there's a set of supporting capabilities, which are very standard kind of horizontal behaviors that, you know, every organization has, but and ultimately support the core capabilities, but they're not the reason we're in business. Those would be things like IT, for example, or finance, supplier management. And then there may be a need to have yet a different kind of capability, an enabling capability, which is, you know, something that really allows a core or supporting capability to be implemented. And we found that in many cases, enabling capabilities are often very much related to the IT domain. And then there's the notion of also being able to specify the type of the capability. So is this something that the executive team has decided is a competitive capability? You know, so we're really working in our marketplace with a shared set of customers, and we're finding ourselves with an opportunity to do a better job at this thing than some of our competitors? Or do we perhaps think it's a differentiating capability? We believe we do it really different, and because of that, that may be an attraction on getting new customers on board. Or do we think it's a commodity application, namely, our commodity capability, namely it's something that, you know, we have to do to stay in business. It's something perhaps all of our competitors do. We all do it equally well or equally bad, and doing it a little bit better is really just not going to get us too much. So this, again, is really trying to get to, you know, when you're building a capability model, you really want to think about what pieces of information you're going to try to capture as it relates to actually using that capability model and then representing it here in your tailored meta model. But then, you know, we really think of, you know, the capability model, the value stream, and the capabilities itself are a part of what we call the strategic business architecture, which is differentiated from the operational business architecture. In particular, the notion of what, you know, the TOGAF content meta model talks about as organization units, functions, and processes, amongst other things. And one of the things that we found through best practice and, you know, ultimately through trial and error is, you know, initially in some of our work that we did, we allowed really capability to be a universal aggregator, namely you could trace anything in the business architecture or IT architecture to a capability. You could, trace organizations units to it, actors, functions, processes, services, applications, technology components, data entities. But what we found is that by keeping it so wide open that basically, you can map anything to a capability, well, guess what? That's exactly what people did, except it was done very inconsistently. So some people would say, well, I really think, looking at capabilities by aggregating processes makes sense for me. Or someone else would say, well, I really want to do it based on applications, or I really want to do it on data and applications and services. So what we found is that that the mapping of elements to capabilities became very inconsistent, which may be not inappropriate when you start with a capability model, but it does have side effects, particularly as it relates to consistent reporting at the enterprise level. So what we're showing here is, generally speaking, a good place to start, particularly for an organization that has a lot of diversity, perhaps grown through, again, mergers and acquisitions, where we have the idea that a capability is operationalized by a function, and a function is owned by an organization unit. And the idea here with a function is that a function is really a group of people within an organization that perform some similar or coherent set of behaviors. And this is very important to be able to handle within a diverse organization, because there may be many organization, lines of business and business units that are performing processes and have groups of people that do the same thing, but they use different language, and which is another thing that can be real challenging in a capability model, because, for example, capabilities will tend to have noun-like names like claims management. There might be a function that has a very similar name called claims management, or, personal claims management, or commercial claims management, as it relates to possibly being a part of different functions. But then when we get to the process, we might actually find that there are multiple processes out there called managed claims or managed commercial claims. So processes tend to be more behavioral, as well as services, and have more, active verb noun kind of names, where the capabilities and functions tend to have noun-like names, and there can often be a lot of overloading between those different things. So if we think about, again, functions being groups of people that, participate in a process, and if we were to represent that process in a BPMN process diagram, we'd often expect to see a function represented as a pool or a lane. Again, a group of people that are performing the activities of a process. And then that function may use a set of IS services that are then provided by an application component. And what you'll notice here is that the application component has some metrics associated with it as well. What's the health of the application? What's its overall risk? And, I'll show you some examples of some data of this in an actual tool. But some thought does need to be put into place about what does it really mean to say that an application is healthy or unhealthy? Is it because of the old technology that it's using, and the fact that there are no longer people available to support it because of obsolescing skills? Does it have to do with how much money we spend on it? Does it have to do with how many defects there are? And a similar sort of thing with respect to risk. What does it mean for an application to be low risk versus high risk? Are custom apps higher risk than package apps? Are older apps riskier than newer apps because they may have security vulnerability? So ultimately, you have to make a significant investment in really understanding what are the metrics that you're going to be collecting through a capability model? How do you collect that data and then possibly derive it? Because we want to have a little bit of some both, empirical data, as well as it'll be often also some subjective data. And one of the most compelling things about making any enterprise architecture model interesting to a broader community is to start throwing financial information into it. So if we happen to know how much an application component costs to actually operate and maintain on an annual basis, what we'll find, very likely, is that a whole bunch of people that perhaps really didn't care about enterprise architecture stuff really start getting very interested in once they see financials associated with it. But, again, you may want to have more than just the total annual cost. There may be a breakdown of that that's based on how much does it cost to, acquire the product, build the product, license the product, to develop the product, and so on and so forth. And then you may find that there's also some non-trivial things you need to put in place to actually get that data, because we've often found that the way that a lot of organizations track cost and investment data around IT applications makes it very difficult to get down to this level of precision. So that's, again, getting back to the whole idea of going through a complete cycle of the ADM to really build and implement a capability model, because it may require actually changing the business processes and underlying applications in IT finance, for example, to support this kind of reporting. Now, when we actually dive into showing some examples, we're going to use a much simpler approach just to, hopefully just keep it as uncomplicated as possible. We're actually going to roll applications up directly to capabilities, so bypassing the idea of the connections through the business architecture and IS services. So just to give you a little bit more idea, what capabilities are, here's a capability specification. This is an excerpt from, I think, our first webinar in the series, the Enterprise Architecture Value Chain, where we talked about a value chain for enterprise architecture, and here's one of the capabilities, business architecture modeling. It's a sub-capability of the parent architecture modeling capability. It is a part of the understand step of the value chain. And then we see a set of services that are offered to actually operationalize and execute that capability, so being able to create a capability model, oddly enough, create an organizational structure model, create a process model and a function model, and establish traceability. There's a certain version of a process that we're using to perform that capability. So that's the business modeling process version 1.2. Again, if we think about the standard notion of a capability being people, process, and tools, so we kind of use a RACI approach for representing that. So the business architect is the one that's responsible for this capability. The one that approves the outcomes of this is the process owner and the capability manager. People that consult are subject matter experts, and someone that we have to keep in the loop is the vice president of the business unit. Tools that we're going to use, in this case, the example is Enterprise Architect from Spark Systems. And then we do want to identify, as it relates to performance management, some sort of KPI. So in this case, number of models created, number of models used. And I'd suggest that, just tracking the number of models you create is not necessarily going to be a demonstration that you're doing good business architecture modeling, but it's at least a demonstration that you're doing it. But the number of models you, for example, used for impact analysis is a little bit more of a compelling metric, because that's hopefully some demonstration that you're getting some value out of it. And then, of course, all capabilities are related. They never, stand alone by themselves. So one capability needs the services of another capability to operate. So here we've got, other capabilities of like current state modeling and metamodel management and tool training and stuff like that to make it actually work. And if we're going to be, using a capability model as a benchmark for understanding our current level of maturity and performance and provide guidance into that future state performance, we might also supplement the specification with a set of requirements that describe what it means to behave at a certain level of maturity. So here we have a different capability, architecture decision-making, part of the architecture planning capability in the strategize step of the value chain. And what you'll see again in the middle is the typical 5 different levels of a capability model, and then the bulleted items within each one of them represent the criteria or conditions that identify what level of performance or maturity you're currently at, and then can be used to help put together action plans on desired improvements for the future state. So now what we're going to do is let's go take a quick look at what this stuff looks like inside an actual enterprise architecture tool. So we're going to be using Spark's Enterprise Architect for our demonstration here. And so hopefully you guys can see this effectively. So here we see, the capability meta model that we were viewing in the PowerPoint earlier. And one of the things that again, that we mentioned that's a part of the preliminary phase is in addition to customizing the meta model, we actually need to implement that in our architecture tools. So to do that within Enterprise Architect, you create what's called a UML profile. So even though this has nothing to do with UML, that's the implementation details for how you make this work within Enterprise Architect. And so, again, keeping this kind of real simple, that we're really going to basically focus on just capabilities and application components and the direct relationships between the two. So we've defined and extended some Archimate elements, which, again, is one of the great things about the tool is that we can, we could use UML as the base language, or we can use Archimate, or we could use UPDM if we're doing stuff within the defense sector. So we basically are saying we want to create a new meta element within the tool called a CBP capability. And what you can see here, again, are all of the different custom properties that we identified in the meta model, different health risk scores, costs, types, and maturity and performance levels. And then we also have a customized application component, which is extending the Archimate application component, which has, again, the base placeholders for that content. And it's important also to point out that one of the things that's missing in the current version of Archimate, version 2.1, is there isn't such a thing as a capability, although it is something that we're talking about in the next version of Archimate. So we decided that we would extend an Archimate business function to create a capability, and then to contextualize things, create another new element called a value stream, which is also a special type of business function. So what we're going to, what we'll use here as a basis for at least trying to, describe what a capability model is and at least getting some basic capability metrics in place is we're going to look at the IT value chain that's a part of the IT for IT reference architecture. So one of the great things is, the IT for IT forum, of which APG is a member, has been using Enterprise Architect to actually build the models that are supporting the standard. And so here we see, an overview of the IT value chain, which is composed of 3 different value streams: strategy to portfolio, requirement to deploy, request to fulfill, and detect to correct. And I'm planning that we'll have some more in-depth session on the IT for IT reference architecture in a future webinar. But the nice thing is that this is a evolving open group standard, and it's a industry vertical standard as it relates to how do we manage the business of running IT. And it happens to be in Enterprise Architect, and it happens to have a capability model. However, that's currently not normative in the standard. So let's just take a quick look at the capabilities that exist within the IT for IT reference architecture. And so here we see, the strategy to portfolio value stream, which again has been typed as a CBP value stream, is an aggregation of a set of explicit capabilities. So, strategy portfolio involves service catalog management, relationship management, architecture, which includes all things enterprise architecture, solution architecture, and so forth, portfolio management, finance, strategy management, et cetera. And again, we're representing the relationships between the capabilities in the value stream by using an aggregation relationship. Again, this is a very simple capability model where there's basically just one level of capabilities, but in other capability models that are really focusing on supporting the frontline business are often 2 or 3 levels deep, where for a specific capability it's broken down into sub-capabilities. For example, we could do that here for architecture and say, well, one architecture sub-capability is enterprise architecture. Another one is solution architecture, for example. So now let's take a look at, the information that we've got in as it relates to some capability metrics. So I'm going to show that in a spreadsheet. And so what we can see here is that we've got a list of, all the capabilities in the IT value chain and the associated value stream that they're related to. And then here in the next number of cells represents the settings that stakeholders worked on determining, what kind of capability is it, both its type and category, some characterizations of the current dispositions towards ongoing investments, the current and level of maturity and performance, as well as the future level of maturity and performance. And so what we can do within Enterprise Architect is we can go ahead and import that content in. We have created a specialized utility for doing this called Model Flow. So I'm basically going to pick a configuration that's basically mapped all of those columns in the spreadsheet. And by the way, this can also get data directly out of repositories through SQL and ODBC. And we're going to basically import that information into the repository. And basically, it's just going through each row and updating the content, finding existing elements so it doesn't create duplicates, so on and so forth. And, what we've just found that, whatever tool you're using, having the ability to get data from external data sources, whether they're spreadsheets or other repositories, is pretty critical because we really, like to think of the enterprise architecture tool as being the clearinghouse for really understanding all the relationships things have across the enterprise, even though it may not be the system of record for all of that content across the enterprise. All right, so now we've imported all of those base capability metrics. So now let's go take a quick look at what that looks like as we've imported it into the product. So let's go look at the capability model and what's called a list view. And so here we can see the capabilities aggregated under the different value streams and the fact that we now have information about whether, they're strategic, maintained, or retired, core, supporting, differentiating, competiting. So for example, I can go ahead here and disable the hierarchy view. And then go ahead and actually do some grouping. So if I want to just see, show me all things grouped by investment decision or investment disposition, I should be able to go ahead and do that, as well as showing things based on capability category. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how we can, visualize this content now that we've created a capability model and pulled in some basic capability metrics. So let's go ahead and create what we call a hierarchy diagram. And since based on the other diagram that we took a look at, we already had explicit relationships between the value stream and the capabilities. When we're going to build this nested box diagram, it sure seems like, why don't we go ahead and try to automate that versus having to rely on people to basically replicate the content that's already in there. But we want to show it visually a little bit different. So we're going to go ahead and create a capability hierarchy diagram. And what this is basically doing is looping through all of the value streams that are part of the value chain, and then going, traversing the aggregation relationships to the individual capabilities, and creating a large box for the value stream itself, and then putting the capabilities that are aggregated under that inside that larger box. So now we have a graphical view of the hierarchy of the capability model. And then what we can do after this is we can then perhaps use it as a heat map, so that we can show different perspectives of the capability model based on different characteristics. So let's start off by perhaps just looking at it based on capability type. And so this is going through and color coding based on the idea that the executive team has decided that certain capabilities are competitive, the ones that are in green. Some are differentiating, the ones that are in blue, and other ones are commodities. So again, this should guide investment planning decisions as it relates to, where are we going to be doing stuff. If, for example, if we're finding that we're investing in a commodity thing, we want to, we be very upfront about, well, why are we doing that? If we've all agreed that this isn't something that really, differentiates us or is a competitive play within the landscape, and so maybe it's really more for an optimization effort. Hey, we do need to make an investment, but it's just because we could do a better job of, workforce management or service test management. But yeah, we agree it's perhaps not going to be as compelling as some other things. Or particularly, one of the principles that a lot of organizations have in place is we should, think about, reusing before buying and then buying before building. And by all means, if there are capabilities that we've determined are commodities, we should be thinking very, very, very carefully about whether it makes any sense to invest custom application development dollars in a commodity capability. So it's very typical that a commodity capability is going to be fulfilled by a package product, for example. But we could also, do some different versions of this. We could, take a look at this from a investment disposition perspective. And so this is doing just a different kind of color coding that has to do with which capabilities are strategic, which ones are we going to just keep as is, and which one are we possibly going to retire because either it's something we used to do that we don't have to do anymore, or our business has changed and it's no longer required that we do that. So I think, basically to maybe partition the content a little effectively, so pardon me for, evolving the agenda as we went here. I guess what I'm thinking is, our next session we can talk about, now that we've got a capability model and we've been able to do some, basic visualization of this content using some sort of modeling tool on some primitive capability metrics, that we can now move on in our next session and talk about more in-depth capability analysis, where we can, explicitly map, in this case, applications to capabilities, and then once that's done, aggregate some of the application metrics up to the capability to use it as a lens for, again, understanding where we perhaps need to make the best investments in our application portfolio. And then it's possible that if we can get this all in the next session, that'd be great. But there possibly could even be a third session where we talk about, now that we have a capability model, it's populated with content, both primitive and derived metrics, and now we're going to be able to use it for better investment decision planning, particularly starting in phase A, but also refining that understanding through phases B, C, and D. But then talk about how can we take this content and actually put together capability-based roadmaps and plans. So that's basically what I wanted to get through today with people. Thanks very much for your kind attention and participation. And Birgit, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Hi, there are actually some questions, Chris. One of the first ones, can you see the questions?
Let me call them up real quick.
We've got one from Bob Muma, and he, let's see. Okay, so his question is, can you recommend sources and sites where one might find examples of capability models? Rather than start from scratch, I'd like to begin with a baseline that can be built upon.
So I think the question is there a source for jump-starting a capability model so you don't have to build one from scratch? When, of course, that's exactly what I did in the demonstration here, which was, taking the IT for IT reference architecture that happens to have a capability model based in it. So that obviously provided me a great luxury in not having to recreate it. And then the ultimate convenience that it happened to be in a tool that we have expertise that was also a great accelerator. So, ultimately, I really think you need to look at industry vertical architecture communities or business communities for that. There are some organizations, for example, Accord, of course, has a a very robust set of processes and services and data elements, and a capability model that's related to the property and casualty insurance business. And so you might look towards that organization if you're in the P&C insurance to kind of get you going. But ultimately, again, look at industry verticals. Other ones that I can think of might be arts, although arts tends to be a little bit more data focused, but I know there is some process stuff in place. There's also buy-in for banking, and if you're in the petrochemical industry, there are some more application really level reference architectures, but just some business ones as well for the petrochemical industry. So ultimately, I think one of the things that end users can do to help manage this is to, keep asking your industry vertical trade groups about, hey, providing a capability model that's aligned with our, vertical business would really help accelerate our work in our organization. So it would be a really great idea if you guys could produce one and, produce it in such a way that it's actually consumable for different modeling tools. So it's not just something that's in a bunch of PDFs that I have to retype. So whether that's in some XML format or within CSV or some other thing that allows interchange.
Can you see the questions, Chris? We've got another one from Roger Fair.
Yeah, all I've got right here is the chat. Let me see if I can find the questions.
Under Q&A, if you click on Q&A, we have one from Roger Fair, and he says, can you clarify how supporting capabilities differ from AEDs in the technology architecture?
All right, so I would consider ultimately capabilities to be architecture building blocks, irrespective of whether they're in the business space or the technology space. One of the things that I just, by the way, try to be careful about is qualifying capability with the word business or IT or technical in front of it, because ultimately I think a capability is always a business capability, because if it's not something that's related to the business, then nobody cares about it. So I would say, ultimately, capabilities that are a part of running the business of IT are architecture building blocks, but they're architecture building blocks of the business architecture of IT, not the technology architecture, if that makes sense. You want me to take a look at one of the next questions, Birgit?
That would be great, Chris.
Next one is, how would you recommend, or would you recommend mapping capabilities to IT and technology capabilities? That's really, again, getting a little bit back to what I was just saying about being careful about differentiating them, because they all should be quote-unquote business capabilities. It's really more of an issue of, are they core capabilities, supporting capabilities, or enabling capabilities? And again, what we found is a lot of the things that we think about or have discovered as our enabling capabilities tend to be capabilities that are significantly technology oriented. So while they may have, a certain technology solution behind them, they still have to have people that manage and run that capability and a set of processes that they go through to operate it as well. Again, when we're creating a basic capability model, we often, again, do that hierarchical decomposition, but it's also, like you saw in a couple of the capability specification examples, the idea that capabilities have dependencies on other capabilities. And so that's where, again, showing relationships amongst capabilities would certainly be something useful to do if it contributes to whatever the outcomes you're expecting from the capability modeling and analysis.
Okay, great. Chris, do you have time for one more from Mohammed Alfar?
Yes. Let's see.
He says, would ECOM as a process classification framework a good idea for capability?
Well, I guess I would say, it would be, better than nothing. You think you want to be careful about is a capability and a process model are not the same, but they are, again, very much related. So you may be able to look at a capability model for telco that it's really saying these are the standard processes a telco should have in place to operate its business. And so it's very likely that you could look at that as a capability model, but making sure that you, in your meta model and the way that you're managing your content, that you keep a separation between the capability and the processes themselves. And there's a couple other suggestions here that, again, APQC also has a whole bunch of hierarchical process models for different lines of business that could also be a great start for that as well.
Okay, great. We're just at 2 minutes before 1. And Chris, I think we've answered pretty much all the questions, although a couple more came in. That's up to you.
Well, yeah, I'd be happy to tackle. Let's see, we have one more around, capability evaluation should be done in the preliminary phase, or can we do it in the vision or business architecture phase? And that really gets into, what I was trying to get to a little bit earlier, which is, in order to do a capability assessment, there has to first be a capability model. So there may be a body of architecture work to do that. Again, hopefully you can get some acceleration by exploiting some industry vertical models. And then you have to, populate it with metrics, do some mapping to things, and that may be another body of work. And then and that's really kind of the intelligence gathering that needs to be put in place, and including, again, operationalizing to make sure that that stays current. And then you're going to be in a great position to, again, use that capability model in phase A for making some investment decisions, and in phases B, C, and D for doing that enterprise-wise impact analysis.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you all for joining us. We will have the next session next. Please visit the AEA site at www.globalaea.org. This session is recorded and will be available for download. And you will also be able to download archived sessions there as well. Thank you, Chris, and we look forward to the next session.
Thank you so much, Birgit, and to the AEA, and look forward to the next one. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you all.